The open road promises freedom, adventure, and endless possibilities. But sometimes, that freedom comes with a price. Tonight, we're diving into 11 road trip experiences that shattered that illusion forever. From fog that refuses to lift, to radio stations that know your every move before you make it, to passengers who shouldn't exist. These travelers encountered something they could never explain, something that transformed a simple drive into a waking nightmare. Whether it was a convoy that wouldn't let them leave, a tunnel that broadcast the dead, or a road that defied the laws of physics itself, each journey revealed that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't your destination. It's realizing you might never reach it. Buckle up, because once you hear what happened to them, you'll never look at a highway the same way again. Let's hit the road. What would you do if you realized the fog around your car wasn't just weather, but something keeping you trapped? Soraya had been driving for nearly 6 hours when they hit the coastal highway, and everyone was ready to be done with the road. She sat in the passenger seat scrolling through her phone while her husband Arian focused on the winding turns ahead. In the back, their 2 kids had finally fallen asleep after endless rounds of car games and snack negotiations. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the ocean below look like it was on fire. It was supposed to be a perfect end to a perfect vacation. Just a few more hours until they'd be home and sleeping in their own beds. That's when the fog rolled in. At first, it seemed normal enough. Coastal highways always had patches of fog in the evening, especially this time of year. Arian slowed down instinctively, flicking on the headlights as the gray walls swallowed their car whole. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet ahead, and Soraya finally looked up from her phone, sensing the change in atmosphere. The fog was thick, unusually so, like driving through cotton that pressed against the windows. Arian leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tighter, his eyes straining to make out the yellow lines on the road. The GPS continued its calm narration, telling them to continue straight for another 40 miles. So he kept driving, figuring they'd emerge from this cloud bank in a few minutes, like they always did. Except they didn't. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. The fog never thinned, never showed even a hint of breaking. Soraya noticed it first, because she'd been watching the time, anxious to get home. She glanced at the dashboard clock and then at the GPS, frowning. They should have covered at least 15 miles by now. But the GPS still showed them in the exact same location as when they'd entered the fog. Arian dismissed it as a glitch, saying the signal probably couldn't penetrate this thick fog. But Soraya felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. She looked out the window, but saw nothing except that suffocating gray pressing against the glass, so thick it almost seemed solid. Another 20 minutes crawled by. The kids woke up, and their daughter immediately asked why it was so foggy and when they'd be home. Arian gave her a reassuring answer. He didn't quite feel himself because something was definitely wrong now. He'd been watching the mile markers, and he could have sworn they'd passed the same one 3 times. That couldn't be right. Mile markers ran in sequential order, they didn't repeat. But he'd distinctly seen marker 247 at least twice now. Soraya had her phone out, trying to get a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no data, not even the emergency signal option. The GPS had frozen completely. The little blue dot stuck in place while the road beneath them continued endlessly forward. That's when Arian saw the taillights. 2 red dots glowing in the fog ahead, another car moving at roughly the same speed they were. Relief flooded through him because at least they weren't alone in this bizarre fog bank. He sped up slightly, thinking maybe they could follow this car, maybe the driver knew something they didn't. But as they got closer, something made his blood run cold. The license plate. He knew that license plate. He'd stared at it 1,000 times in parking lots and driveways. It was their license plate. They were following themselves. Arian slammed on the brakes, and the taillights ahead disappeared instantly. Soraya grabbed the dashboard, her heart pounding, demanding to know what was happening. Arian couldn't answer because he didn't know. He sat there in the middle of the highway, engine idling, fog swirling around them like something alive. The silence inside the car was deafening. Even the kids had gone quiet, sensing their parents' fear. Soraya's voice came out barely above a whisper when she pointed at the fuel gauge. It hadn't moved. They'd been driving for over an hour in this fog, and the needle sat in the exact same position it had been when they entered. That was impossible. They should have burned through at least a quarter tank by now. Arian made a decision. He pulled a U-turn, tires squealing slightly on the damp asphalt, and headed back the way they came. If they couldn't go forward, they'd go backward until they found the edge of this nightmare. Soraya agreed, gripping his hand tightly as they drove. Minutes ticked by. The fog remained impenetrable. The GPS stayed frozen. And then Arian saw it again. Those same taillights ahead of them, even though they were driving in the opposite direction now. He couldn't breathe. Physics didn't work like this. Roads didn't work like this. But there it was, their own car ahead of them, driving away into the fog. Time stopped making sense. Soraya checked her phone obsessively, watching the clock. But something felt wrong about the way the minutes passed. Sometimes 5 minutes would go by in what felt like 30 seconds. Other times, a single minute would stretch into an eternity. The kids started crying, not understanding, just feeling the wrongness that had saturated the air inside the car. Arian kept driving because stopping felt worse. Like if he stopped moving completely, they'd be stuck in this gray nothing forever. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. His eyes burned from staring into the relentless fog. And still, dawn never came. That's what finally broke Soraya. She'd been watching the clock, and over 3 hours had passed since they entered the fog. It was well past midnight now. The sun should have been gone completely. The sky should have been black. But the fog maintained the same gray twilight quality it had when they first entered. No darker, no lighter, just eternal dusk suspended in time. She started to cry, asking Arian what was happening to them. And he had no answer because this wasn't something that could be explained by logic or reason. They were trapped, caught in something that shouldn't exist. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog lifted. One moment they were drowning in gray, and the next, the air cleared, and they could see stars overhead and the dark ocean stretching out beside the highway. Arian nearly sobbed with relief, pressing harder on the accelerator, desperate to put distance between them and whatever that had been. Soraya grabbed her phone and saw bars appear, signal flooding back. She immediately pulled up the GPS, trying to figure out where they were. Her face went pale. According to their location, they were 60 miles south of where they'd entered the fog. They'd somehow driven backward while moving forward, covering distance that should have taken them an hour in the opposite direction they'd been traveling. They drove home in silence, both too shaken to speak, too afraid that talking about it might somehow summon it back. The kids fell asleep again, exhausted from fear and confusion. When they finally pulled into their driveway, the clock showed it was nearly 4 in the morning. They'd lost 8 hours. 8 hours that couldn't be accounted for. 8 hours that felt like both minutes and days simultaneously. It wasn't until the next day, that Soraya found them. She'd been looking through the photos on her phone, trying to find vacation pictures to share with friends. When she scrolled past images she didn't remember taking, her hands started shaking. The photos were from inside the car, dark and blurry, but clear enough to see what they showed. Shadowy figures standing outside the car windows. Tall, impossibly thin silhouettes pressed against the glass, peering in at them while they'd been driving through that fog. There were dozens of photos, all time-stamped during those missing hours, all showing those figures watching them, surrounding them, keeping them prisoner in that gray nothing. The worst part was the final photo. It showed Arian asleep at the wheel, head tilted back, mouth open. Beside him, Soraya was also unconscious, slumped against the door. In the back, the kids were passed out in their car seats, and standing in the headlights ahead, barely visible through the fog, was a crowd of those shadow figures, all facing the car, all perfectly still. The photo's timestamp showed it was taken at 70 miles per hour. Someone, or something, had been driving their car while they all slept, carrying them through that impossible fog to wherever it wanted them to go. They never took the coastal highway again. And they never looked at the dashcam footage, because some questions don't have answers anyone wants to hear. What would you do if a radio station started describing your every move before you made it? Connor had been driving for 3 hours straight through the desert, and the monotony was starting to get to him. The highway stretched out like a black ribbon through endless sand and scrub brush, perfectly straight, perfectly empty. It was 2 in the morning, and he hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The darkness out here was absolute, the kind of darkness that made the universe feel too big and himself too small. He'd volunteered to take the overnight drive because someone had to move the equipment to Phoenix by morning, and the overtime pay was good. But now, alone with nothing but the hum of tires on asphalt and the vast emptiness pressing in from all sides, he was starting to regret that decision. The radio had been cycling through static for the last 20 minutes. Out here, stations faded in and out like ghosts, giving him a few seconds of music or talk before dissolving back into white noise. Connor kept scanning, desperate for any kind of human voice to break up the oppressive silence. Country, pop, Spanish-language broadcasts, religious programming, anything would do. His finger pressed the seek button over and over, watching the digital numbers climb through the FM spectrum. That's when he landed on 98.6, a frequency that came through crystal clear, sharp, and perfect, like it was broadcasting from the next room instead of miles away across empty desert. Except there was no music. Just a voice. A man's voice, calm and measured, speaking in the tone of someone reading a weather report. Connor almost moved past it, but then he caught a few words that made his hand freeze on the dial. The voice said his specific truck, blue Chevy Silverado, 2019 model, slight dent in the rear bumper. Connor's heart stuttered. He turned up the volume, leaning closer to the speakers like that would help him understand better. The voice continued, unbothered, clinical. It described the cargo he was carrying, listed the mile marker he'd just passed, even mentioned the coffee stain on his shirt from the gas station back in Barstow. For a few seconds, Connor's brain refused to process what he was hearing. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe this was some weird prank show. Maybe they just happened to describe a truck like his. But then the voice said his name. Connor is confused right now. He's trying to rationalize what he's hearing. His heart rate is elevated. He's going to reach for his phone in approximately 4 seconds to see if someone is watching him. Connor's hand was already moving toward his phone before the sentence finished. He jerked it back like the device had burned him. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. The voice didn't stop. It continued its narration with that same detached, almost bored tone. Connor is checking his mirrors now. There's nothing behind him, nothing ahead. He's completely alone on this stretch of highway, or at least he thinks he is. Mile marker 247 is approaching on his right. He's going to pass it in 8 seconds. Connor's eyes snapped to the roadside. And sure enough, marker 247 emerged from the darkness exactly when the voice said it would. His mouth went dry. He grabbed the radio dial and twisted it, killing the station, plunging the cab into silence. His breathing was too loud in the enclosed space. This was insane. Radio stations didn't work like this. They couldn't know these things. He drove in silence for 5 minutes, trying to calm down, trying to think logically. Maybe it was stress. Maybe he was more tired than he thought, and his brain was playing tricks on him. Maybe he should pull over, get some sleep, and continue in the morning when he wasn't hallucinating impossible radio broadcasts. But curiosity is a vicious thing. And despite every instinct screaming at him not to, Connor reached out and turned the radio back to 98.6. The voice was still there, waiting for him. Connor turned the radio off at 2:17 a.m. He needed 5 minutes and 32 seconds to convince himself to turn it back on. He's frightened, but he's also curious. Curiosity might be the most dangerous human trait. Connor's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "Who are you?" he shouted at the radio, knowing it was pointless, knowing he wouldn't get an answer. But the voice responded, not to him directly, but about him. Connor just asked who I am. He's hoping for an explanation that makes sense. There isn't one. Not one he'd accept anyway. He's going to check his rearview mirror again in 3 seconds. Connor's eyes involuntarily flicked to the mirror. Empty road behind him, just like before. The voice was inside his head now, predicting his movements, and the worst part was that he couldn't stop himself from following the script. The predictions became more specific, more immediate. He's going to tighten his grip on the steering wheel. He's going to take a deep breath. He's going to wonder if he's going crazy. Each statement came true as it was spoken, Connor's body moving before his conscious mind could catch up. He tried to fight it, tried to do something, anything the voice didn't predict. But he couldn't. It was like the voice wasn't predicting the future so much as creating it, speaking his actions into existence. Or worse, like his free will had always been an illusion, and he was just now becoming aware of it. Then the voice changed tone, became more urgent. Connor is approaching a critical junction. In approximately 3 miles, he'll have a choice to make. The road forks, left or right. One leads home, one doesn't. He needs to choose carefully. Connor's heart was hammering now. He strained his eyes, looking for this fork in the road. He'd driven this highway dozens of times and didn't remember any fork. But fear was a living thing in his chest now, because the voice had been right about everything else. 2 miles now. Connor is scared. He should be. He's considering accelerating, trying to outrun what's coming. That won't help. The fork appeared in his headlights exactly when the voice said it would. An unmarked split in the highway that absolutely should not exist. Connor slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the asphalt. Both roads looked identical, both disappearing into darkness, giving no hint which was correct. The voice provided no guidance now, just watched through its invisible eyes as Connor sat frozen at the junction. His GPS was useless, showing only the single highway with no fork. His phone had no signal. He was alone with this decision and this voice that seemed to know everything except which direction he should go. Connor has 30 seconds to decide. 29, 28. The countdown was relentless, each number driving spikes of panic deeper into his chest. He looked left, then right, then left again, searching for any sign, any indication of the correct choice. There was nothing. Just darkness and desert, and those two roads leading to unknown destinations. 15 seconds. Connor's going to guess. There's no other option. Guessing is all any of us ever do, really. 10 seconds. Connor put his foot on the accelerator. 5 seconds. He jerked the wheel right, choosing on pure instinct, praying to anyone listening that it was correct. The voice began counting down from 10 as soon as he made his choice. But the tone had shifted into something that sounded almost like anticipation. 10, 9, 8. Connor accelerated, the truck's engine roaring as he pushed it faster. 7, 6, 5. He didn't know what would happen at 0, but every cell in his body was screaming that he didn't want to find out. 4, 3, 2. The road ahead looked the same as it had for hours, empty and straight and endless. 1. Connor braced himself. 0. Every light went out. The headlights died. The dashboard went black. The radio cut to silence. Even the stars overhead seemed to extinguish, leaving Connor in absolute perfect darkness, while the truck continued barreling forward at 80 miles per hour. He couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except his own scream. His hands locked on the wheel, too terrified to move, too terrified to brake, because he had no idea if he was still on the road or about to plunge into a ravine. Time stretched into infinity in that darkness. Seconds feeling like hours, his mind conjuring 1,000 horrible ends. Then the lights came back. All of them, simultaneously, as if someone had flipped a switch. Connor gasped, his vision adjusting, and saw he was still on the highway, still between the lines, still somehow alive. The radio was silent now, 98.6 showing nothing but static. He grabbed the dial and scanned frantically through every frequency, but the voice was gone. Whatever it had been, whatever had just happened, it was over. Connor's entire body was shaking. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the air conditioning. He wanted to pull over, wanted to stop and collect himself, but he was too afraid to stop moving now. He drove straight through to Phoenix, never stopping, never slowing down. The sun came up and burned away the nightmare quality of the desert darkness. But it didn't burn away what had happened. When he finally pulled into the delivery depot, exhausted and rattled, he found something in the cup holder that made his blood freeze. A USB drive. He'd never seen it before. It hadn't been there when he left. He knew he should throw it away, knew he shouldn't look. But that same curiosity that made him turn the radio back on wouldn't let him ignore it. Later, in his apartment, he plugged it into his laptop. The drive contained audio files, dozens of them, each one labeled with a date and time. His hands trembled as he clicked the first one. The voice came through his computer speakers. That same calm, clinical tone. But this time, it was describing events that hadn't happened yet. Connor listening to this recording. Connor going to work tomorrow. Connor taking a different route home. Each file was dated days, weeks, months into the future. The final file was dated exactly 1 year from today. Connor's finger hovered over it, terrified and desperate to know. He clicked it. The voice spoke one sentence. Connor shouldn't have chosen right. Then silence. Just silence and the sound of his own racing heart and the horrible knowledge that somewhere out there, something was watching, predicting, narrating his life, like a story that had already been written, and he was powerless to change a single word. What would you do if you realized your passenger had been dead for decades? Waverly had been driving for a rideshare company for almost 2 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. Drunk college kids, awkward first dates, business travelers who spent the entire ride on conference calls. The job paid her bills while she finished nursing school. And most nights were uneventful enough that she could listen to podcasts and let her mind wander. But tonight felt different from the moment she accepted the pickup request. It came through at 11:47 p.m., downtown, outside a corner that Waverly knew had been abandoned for years. The old department store had closed down when she was still in high school, and the surrounding blocks had slowly died with it. Nobody went down there anymore, especially not at midnight. She almost declined the ride. But the fare was good, and the destination was only 15 minutes away. Easy money. Waverly pulled up to the curb and looked around, seeing nothing but empty sidewalks and darkened storefronts. The streetlights cast weak yellow pools that barely pushed back the shadows. Rain had started falling about an hour ago, and now it came down in steady sheets that turned the streets into black mirrors. She checked the app again, confirming this was the right location, and waited. 30 seconds passed. Then a figure emerged from the darkness between buildings, moving slowly toward the car. The passenger was a woman, maybe mid-30s, wearing a long gray coat that looked like it belonged in a different decade. Her hair hung wet and straight, plastered to her face, and she clutched a small purse against her chest. Waverly unlocked the doors, and the woman slid into the back seat without a word. The interior light flickered on briefly, and Waverly caught a glimpse of her passenger's face. Pale, blank expression, eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. "Hi, I'm Waverly. You're headed to 2847 Maple Street?" The woman nodded silently, and Waverly pulled away from the curb, windshield wipers beating a rhythm against the rain. The first few minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. Waverly tried to make small talk, asking about the weather, about how the woman's night was going, but received only single-word responses or nods. Some passengers were like that, preferring silence. So Waverly let it go and focused on driving. But something felt off. The car's interior had gone cold despite the heater running full blast. Waverly could see her breath misting in the air, which made no sense. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like standing water and old concrete, the smell of places that had been closed up too long. Waverly adjusted the rearview mirror to check on her passenger and felt her stomach drop. The woman was sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead with those empty eyes. But that wasn't what made Waverly's heart start to race. In the mirror's reflection, the back seat appeared empty. She could see the headrest, the seatbelt, the window behind, but no passenger. Waverly jerked her head around to look directly at the back seat. The woman was there, solid and real, exactly where she'd been. Waverly turned back to the mirror. Empty. She looked back again. The woman was there. This wasn't possible. Her hands started shaking on the steering wheel. Waverly told herself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by exhaustion and rain and the weird shadows from passing streetlights. She focused on the road, trying to ignore the growing dread settling into her bones. The GPS directed her through increasingly empty streets, away from the main roads and into older residential areas where the houses sat far back from the street and trees grew thick overhead. The woman hadn't moved since getting in the car. Waverly hadn't heard her shift position even once, hadn't heard the rustle of clothing or the sound of breathing. "So, have you lived at this address long?" Waverly tried again, desperate for any sound besides the rain and her own thundering heartbeat. The woman's response came after a long pause, and her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "I used to. Long time ago." Waverly glanced in the rearview mirror again. Still nothing. Just an empty back seat. "Are you visiting someone?" The woman didn't answer this time. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Waverly noticed the windows were fogging up despite the cold, condensation forming patterns that almost looked deliberate, like fingers drawing shapes in the moisture. The GPS announced they were 2 minutes from the destination. Waverly had never been so relieved to hear anything in her life. She just needed to get through 2 more minutes, drop off this passenger, and then she was done for the night. No more rides. She'd go home, take a hot shower, and forget this ever happened. Maple Street appeared ahead, a narrow road lined with old houses that had seen better days. The GPS directed her to slow down, approaching the address. Number 2847. Waverly pulled up to the curb, and her blood turned to ice. There was no house, just a foundation, crumbling and overgrown with weeds. The walls were gone. The roof was gone. All that remained were the concrete steps leading up to nothing, and the skeletal outline of where rooms used to be. In the center of the ruins, a brick chimney stood alone, like a gravestone. This house had been destroyed a long time ago. Waverly's mouth went dry. "I think there's been a mistake. This address doesn't..." She turned to look at her passenger, and the words died in her throat. The woman was staring directly at her now, and her eyes had changed. They weren't empty anymore. They were filled with something terrible. Something that looked like profound sadness mixed with an awareness that didn't belong in a living person's face. Water dripped from her hair, forming puddles on the seat, more water than should have been possible from just rain. The woman's lips moved, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Thank you for taking me home one last time." Then she was gone. Not fading, not slowly disappearing. Just gone, between one blink and the next, like she'd never been there at all. Except the back seat was soaking wet. Water covered the leather, pooled in the seat's contours, dripped onto the floor mats. Waverly's breathing came in short gasps. She scrambled out of the car into the rain, needing to put distance between herself and that wet seat, needing to prove to herself she was still in reality. She looked at the ruined foundation, then back at her car. The rear door was still closed. She hadn't heard it open. The woman couldn't have gotten out. But she was gone. Waverly pulled out her phone with trembling hands and opened the rideshare app. She needed to see the passenger's profile, needed some kind of explanation. But when she opened the ride details, there was no passenger information. The pickup location showed correctly. The destination showed correctly. But where the rider's name and photo should have been, there was just blank space. The fare showed $0. According to the app, she'd just driven an empty car across town for no reason. Waverly felt like she was losing her mind. She got back in the car, unable to stay out in the rain any longer, and sat shivering in the driver's seat. She needed to call someone, needed to report this, needed something to make sense. But what would she say? That she'd picked up a ghost? That she'd driven a dead woman to a house that no longer existed? Nobody would believe her. She wasn't sure she believed herself. Maybe she'd fallen asleep at the wheel. Maybe this was all a vivid dream and she'd wake up at a red light with other drivers honking at her. But the water in the back seat was real. She could smell it, that stagnant odor of water that had been sitting too long in dark places. Waverly forced herself to think rationally. She pulled up a browser on her phone and typed in the address. The results made her stomach lurch. The first link was a news article from 1989. Fire claims life on Maple Street. She clicked it with numb fingers. The article described a house fire at 2847 Maple Street that had killed a woman. The house had burned to the foundation. Investigators ruled it accidental. The woman had been alone. Her name was listed in the article. Waverly's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. She scrolled down to the victim's photo, a grainy black and white image scanned from an old newspaper. The woman staring back at her from the screen was the same woman who'd been sitting in her back seat. Same hair, same face, same empty eyes. The article was dated October 8th, 1989, 36 years ago. Today, the anniversary. The woman had died exactly 36 years ago today, and somehow, impossibly, Waverly had just driven her home. She sat there for a long time, rain drumming on the roof, staring at that photo until her phone screen went dark. When she finally started the car and drove away, she couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror. Terrified she'd see an empty back seat, or worse, that she'd see the woman sitting there again. The water took 3 days to fully dry, and even after professional cleaning, the back seat never quite felt right again. Sometimes, on rainy nights, Waverly swore she could still smell that stagnant water smell, still feel that impossible cold. She never accepted another ride from that part of downtown. And she learned to trust the rearview mirror, because sometimes what it doesn't show is more important than what it does. Some passengers are going home, and some are already there, trapped in the moment of their death, riding the same route forever, looking for something they lost when the flames took everything away. What would you do if you were surrounded by hundreds of identical trucks that refused to let you leave? Lennon and Yasmin left the city just before dawn, trying to beat the morning traffic. They'd planned this weekend trip for months, a chance to get away from their cramped apartment and the suffocating routine of their lives. The farmland stretched out on either side of the highway, endless fields of corn turning golden in the early morning light. Yasmin was asleep in the passenger seat, her head tilted against the window, and Lennon had the music low, just loud enough to keep him alert. The highway was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional semi-truck hauling goods to distant warehouses. It was peaceful, simple, exactly what they needed. Lennon merged onto Interstate 70 and settled into the right lane, cruise control set at a comfortable 65. The sun was starting to paint the clouds orange and pink, and he felt genuinely content for the first time in weeks. That feeling lasted for about 10 minutes. Then he noticed the trucks. At first, it didn't register as unusual. A white moving truck passed him on the left. Standard commercial vehicle, nothing remarkable. Then another one. Same make, same model, same generic moving company logo on the side. Then another, and another. Within 5 minutes, Lennon counted at least 20 identical white trucks, all traveling in the same direction, all maintaining perfect spacing between each other. He frowned, watching them in his mirrors. It was odd, but not impossible. Maybe they were part of a fleet heading to the same distribution center? But then more appeared, merging onto the highway from every on-ramp, sliding into formation with mechanical precision. Lennon started counting, losing track somewhere around 50. The trucks surrounded his car now, boxing him in on all sides. One in front, one behind, one to his left. When he tried to speed up, the truck ahead matched his acceleration. When he slowed down, the one behind closed the gap. They were hemming him in deliberately. Yasmin woke up when Lennon's driving became more erratic, his attempts to find an opening in the convoy growing desperate. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked around at the wall of white trucks surrounding them. What's going on? Her voice was thick with sleep, confused. Lennon's hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. I don't know. These trucks won't let me pass. I've been trying to get around them for the last 15 minutes. Yasmin looked ahead, behind, to the sides. White trucks everywhere, like they'd driven into a river of them and were being swept along with no control over their direction. She pulled out her phone to check the GPS. Maybe find an alternate route, but the signal was gone. No bars, no data. Just that dead zone icon that shouldn't exist this close to a major interstate. The highway stretched ahead in a perfectly straight line, and the convoy showed no signs of braking. Yasmin counted the trucks she could see. At least 100, maybe more. This is really weird, Lennon. How are there this many identical trucks? He'd been wondering the same thing. Commercial fleets usually had variations, different model years, different license plates at least. But these trucks were identical in every way he could see. Same paint, same logos, same everything. That's when Lennon made a decision. The next exit was coming up in 2 miles. He'd force his way out of this convoy, even if he had to be aggressive about it. As the exit approached, he signaled and started to merge right, trying to push into the space between 2 trucks. But they closed ranks immediately, the gap disappearing before he could claim it. He tried again, more aggressively this time, actually nudging his car toward the truck beside him. The truck didn't budge, didn't brake, didn't react at all. It was like trying to push against a wall. Yasmin grabbed the handle above her door, her knuckles white. Lennon, don't. You're going to cause an accident. But Lennon was past caring about caution. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to get out of this convoy. The exit ramp passed by on their right, but the trucks wouldn't let them reach it. He tried again at the next exit with the same result. The convoy held them prisoner, carrying them forward to some unknown destination. Yasmin's breathing was getting faster, panic setting in. Why are they doing this? What do they want? Lennon had no answers. He tried honking, tried flashing his lights, tried anything to get a reaction from the drivers of these trucks. Nothing worked. Then Yasmin noticed something that made her blood run cold. She leaned forward, staring at the truck directly in front of them, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. Lennon, look at the driver. He glanced up, trying to see into the cab of the truck ahead. At first, he couldn't make out any details through the glare on the windshield. But then the angle shifted, and he saw. The driver was wearing a gray uniform, plain and generic. But it was the driver's face that made Lennon's heart skip. Even from this distance, even through 2 windshields, he could see something was off about the features. Too symmetrical, too identical to the driver in the truck beside them, and the truck beside that one. Yasmin was checking all the visible trucks now, craning her neck to see into each cab they passed. Every driver looked the same. Same gray uniform, same posture, same face. It was like someone had copied and pasted the same person into hundreds of trucks. This isn't real, Yasmin said, her voice shaking. This can't be real. People don't look identical. This isn't possible. But it was happening, whether possible or not. They were trapped in a convoy of identical trucks, driven by identical people, being carried towards something neither of them could understand. Lennon noticed something else that sent fresh waves of fear through his system. The other vehicles on the highway were gone. Not just sparse, completely gone. When they'd first merged onto the interstate, there had been regular traffic, cars and trucks heading in both directions. Now there was nothing except the convoy. The southbound lanes were empty. No cars passed them going the opposite direction. It was just them and these white trucks on an endless highway through farmland that was starting to look repetitive in a way that made Lennon's eyes hurt. "Check the license plates," Lennon said suddenly. Yasmin looked at him, not understanding, but then she focused on the truck ahead. The plate was visible, a standard commercial plate. She memorized the number and then looked at the truck in the next lane. Same number, exactly the same. She checked another, same. Every truck they could see had the identical license plate number. That wasn't just strange anymore. That was impossible. That was confirmation that whatever this was, it had left the realm of rational explanation. Time became difficult to track. Lennon looked at the clock on the dashboard, but the numbers seemed wrong. They'd been in this convoy for what felt like hours, but the clock showed only 30 minutes had passed. Or had it been 30 minutes? He couldn't remember what time they'd merged onto the highway. Yasmin was checking her phone obsessively, but it remained dead. No signal, no connection to the outside world. They were isolated in this moving prison of trucks, cut off from everything that made sense. Then Lennon noticed something that made his stomach drop. On the side of one of the trucks, he caught a glimpse of a license plate. Not the truck's plate, but a car's plate, mounted on the side like a trophy. He looked closer at the other trucks, and his vision started to swim. Many of them had license plates attached to their sides, dozens of them, different states and styles. And there, 3 trucks ahead, he saw one that made him want to scream. It was his plate. His license plate number, mounted on the side of one of the white trucks like a prize. "Yasmin." His voice cracked. "Yasmin, look." He pointed, but she'd already seen it. She'd gone pale, her hand pressed against her mouth. Their license plate was already on one of these trucks, which meant they'd been here before. Or they were going to be. Or time didn't work the way it should in this place. Lennon's mind was fracturing, trying to understand. He looked down at his car, really looked at it for the first time since the convoy had surrounded them. The interior seemed slightly different. Less detailed somehow, like a copy of a copy. Then he noticed his hands on the steering wheel. The skin looked wrong, the texture not quite right. He looked at Yasmin and saw her staring at her own hands with growing horror. "Lennon, what's happening to us?" He could see it now. Their car was changing. The color was leaching out, turning from red to a pale pink to white. Thus the radio had disappeared from the dashboard. The back seat was gone, replaced by cargo space. They were transforming, being absorbed, becoming part of the convoy. Yasmin started screaming. Lennon jerked the wheel hard, not caring anymore about the consequences, and crashed through the barrier on the right side of the highway. Metal shrieked, airbags deployed. The car tumbled down an embankment, rolling over twice before slamming to a stop in a drainage ditch. Lennon's head was ringing, blood in his mouth, but he was alive. Yasmin was beside him, conscious, crying but alive. He looked back up at the highway, expecting to see the convoy, expecting to see those white trucks coming for them. The highway was empty, completely empty. No trucks, no convoy, nothing. Just an ordinary stretch of interstate in the morning sun. Lennon and Yasmin climbed out of their wrecked car, checking themselves for injuries. They were bruised and shaken but intact. A state trooper arrived 20 minutes later, responding to the crash. He seemed confused about their story, about why they'd crashed through a barrier on a straight stretch of road with no obstacles. But he didn't question it too much. Accidents happened. It wasn't until they were in the tow truck, heading back to town, that Yasmin noticed the white paint on their hood. fresh paint, like they'd scraped against something white. And when the insurance adjuster inventoried their belongings from the wrecked car, he found gray uniforms in the trunk. New, still in plastic, their sizes. Neither of them had put those there. Neither of them had ever seen them before. But they fit perfectly. What would you do if helping a lost child meant following them into the frozen darkness? Bridger had been driving for 11 hours straight, pushing through exhaustion because he needed to reach his sister's house before midnight. She was going through a rough divorce, and he'd promised to be there for her. Promised he wouldn't let her spend another night alone in that big, empty house. The mountain pass was the fastest route, cutting hours off the journey, but it was dangerous this time of year. Snow had started falling around dusk, light at first, just flurries that melted on the windshield. But as he climbed higher into the mountains, the snow became heavier, more insistent, until his wipers could barely keep up with the accumulation. The road twisted like a snake, hairpin turns every few hundred yards, steep drops on one side that disappeared into darkness. Bridger's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, his eyes burning from staring into the hypnotic swirl of snowflakes in his headlights. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The temperature had dropped dramatically, his dashboard showing 18 degrees, and ice was forming on the edges of the windshield, where the defroster couldn't quite reach. He should have taken the long way around. He should have waited until morning. But he'd made a promise, and Bridger didn't break promises. That's when his headlights caught the child. A small figure standing in the middle of the road, maybe 50 feet ahead, arms at their sides, completely still. Bridger's heart jumped into his throat, and he slammed on the brakes. The car immediately started sliding on the icy surface, the tires unable to find purchase. He steered into the skid, fighting for control, and the car finally came to a stop about 20 feet from where the child stood. His hands were shaking on the wheel, adrenaline flooding his system. A kid. There was a kid standing in the middle of a mountain pass in a snowstorm at night. What the hell was a kid doing out here? Bridger threw the car into park and jumped out, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond, didn't move. Just stood there in the falling snow, wearing what looked like a thin jacket and no hat. No gloves. Nothing appropriate for this weather. Bridger ran toward them, his boots crunching on the fresh snow, his breath coming out in white clouds. "Hey kid, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" He got within 10 feet, close enough to see the child more clearly. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair plastered to his head from the snow. His skin was pale, lips turning blue from the cold. But before Bridger could reach him, the boy turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the darkness and swirling snow. "Wait! Stop!" Bridger ran after him, forgetting about his car, forgetting about everything except the fact that a child was wandering into the wilderness in freezing conditions. He followed the small, footprints in the snow, pushing through drifts that came up to his knees. The boy should have been just ahead, should have been visible, but Bridger couldn't see him anymore. Just footprints leading deeper into the trees, away from the road, away from safety. Bridger's rational mind was screaming at him to go back, to call for help. But his instincts as a human being wouldn't let him abandon a child in this weather. He pulled out his phone, trying to call 911, but there was no signal up here. The mountains were too remote, too high. He was on his own. The footprints continued ahead, and Bridger followed them, calling out into the storm. "I'm trying to help you. Please stop. You're going to freeze out here." No response. Just the wind and the endless snow and those small footprints leading him higher into the mountains. He'd been following for maybe 15 minutes when he realized he couldn't see his car anymore. The road had disappeared behind him, swallowed by darkness and weather. Panic started to set in. This was bad. This was really bad. He was lost now, chasing a child who might not even exist, who might be a hypothermia-induced hallucination. But the footprints were real. He could see them. Small shoe prints, child-sized, too detailed to be imagined. Bridger turned in a circle, trying to orient himself, and that's when he saw the boy again. Standing about 30 feet uphill, barely visible through the snow, watching him. "Please," Bridger shouted, his voice raw from the cold. "Just stay there. Let me help you." The boy tilted his head, like he was considering the request, and then turned and continued walking. Uphill. Always uphill. Bridger cursed and followed, his legs burning from the exertion, his lungs aching from breathing the freezing air. The temperature was dropping further. His dashboard had said 18 degrees, but up here, exposed to the wind, it had to be close to 0. His fingers were going numb even inside his gloves. His face felt like it was being cut by tiny knives. That's when he saw the first car, an old sedan covered in snow, sitting abandoned among the trees. The driver's door was open. Bridger approached it cautiously, hope flaring that maybe someone was inside, maybe someone who could help. But the car was empty. He shined his phone's flashlight inside and saw the keys still in the ignition. The gas gauge showed half a tank. Why would someone abandon a perfectly good car up here? He looked at the license plate, noting the registration sticker was from 15 years ago. A sound made him turn. The boy was closer now, only 10 feet away, and for the first time, Bridger could see his face clearly. The child's eyes were wrong. Too wide, too knowing, ancient in a way that children's eyes should never be. And he wasn't shivering. Despite the thin jacket, despite the snow covering his hair and shoulders, despite the fact that his breath should have been visible in this cold, the boy showed no signs of being affected by the temperature. "Who are you?" Bridger whispered, and the boy smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was something else wearing a child's face. The boy turned and walked away again, and this time Bridger saw other cars. Dozens of them, scattered through the trees, all pointing uphill, all abandoned. Different makes, different models, different decades. Some were so old that rust had consumed most of the metal. Some were newer, their paint still visible under the snow. All of them had their doors open. All of them faced the same direction, toward the summit of the mountain. Bridger's mind was screaming at him now, every survival instinct he had telling him to run, to get back to the road, to escape while he still could. But he couldn't stop following. It was like something had hooked into his chest and was pulling him forward. His legs moved without conscious thought, following those footprints, following that boy through the snow and the darkness. He passed more abandoned cars, and then he started seeing the drivers. They were still in their vehicles, frozen solid, hands on the steering wheels, faces turned toward the summit. Ice crystals covered their skin, preserved them in death like museum exhibits. Bridger tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't work anymore. The cold had stolen it. The boy was always ahead, always just visible enough to follow, but never close enough to catch. Bridger's thoughts were becoming sluggish, his movements uncoordinated. Hypothermia. He was dying. He knew he was dying. But he couldn't stop walking. The pull was too strong. He understood now, in the fading moments of his consciousness, that the boy wasn't a child. The boy was a lure, a trap, something that had been drawing people up this mountain for decades, maybe centuries. All those abandoned cars, all those frozen drivers, they'd all followed just like he was following now. Bridger fell to his knees in the snow. His body wouldn't move anymore. The cold had won. He looked up and saw the boy standing directly in front of him now, finally stopped, finally still. The boy's face was changing, the features shifting into something older, something that had never been human. Bridger tried to speak, tried to ask why, but only frost came from his lips. The thing wearing the boy's shape leaned close, and when it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through dead trees. Every winter, the mountain needs to be fed. Then it was gone, vanished into the snow, leaving Bridger alone in the darkness. His last thought, as the cold closed in and his vision faded to black, was that he'd broken his promise to his sister. She'd be alone tonight after all. He tried to reach for his phone one more time, but his fingers wouldn't respond. The snow continued to fall, covering him slowly, gently, like a burial shroud. By morning, he'd be another statue in the forest, another frozen driver reaching toward a summit he'd never reach. 3 days later, a state highway patrol found his car on the mountain pass, engine still running, door hanging open. They searched the area but found no sign of Bridger. Just his footprints leading off the road into the trees, and then nothing, like he'd simply ceased to exist. The search was called off after a week. Too dangerous to continue in winter conditions. They'd try again in spring when the snow melted. But spring came and went, and they never found a body. Local residents could have told them not to bother. They knew about the mountain, about the thing that lived up there. Every few years, someone would go missing on that pass, always in winter, always at night. The old-timers called it the shepherd because it led the lost higher and higher until there was no way back. They said you could see the cars from the hiking trails in summer, rusted husks scattered through the forest, all facing upward like they'd been trying to drive to heaven. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the peaks, drivers report seeing a child standing on the side of the road, thumb out like they're hitchhiking, eyes too old for their young face. Most people drive past, something primal in their brain warning them not to stop. But every winter, someone pulls over. Someone offers help. Someone follows those small footprints into the darkness, answering a call they don't understand, climbing toward a summit that exists beyond any map, beyond any human understanding of geography or mercy. The mountain is always hungry, and the shepherd is always waiting. What would you do if everyone at a rest stop was a missing person who didn't know they were lost? Quentin, Marlee, and Leilani had been on the road for 8 hours, driving through the kind of endless nothing that makes up most of the Midwest. Flat land, straight highways, and towns so small they barely registered as more than a gas station and a handful of houses. They were heading back to college after spring break, sharing driving duties and passing the time with terrible road trip playlists and even worse jokes. When Quentin saw the rest stop sign, he didn't think twice about pulling off. They all needed to stretch their legs, use the bathroom, and maybe grab some snacks before the final 4-hour push to campus. The rest stop appeared like an oasis after miles of empty highway. It was bigger than expected, a sprawling complex with a main building, picnic areas, and even what looked like a small playground. The architecture was oddly retro, all pastel colors and curved edges that reminded Quentin of diners from old movies. The parking lot was half full, which seemed unusual for this time of night. But he figured maybe there was a reason this particular rest stop was popular. He pulled into a spot near the entrance, and all 3 of them climbed out, groaning as their stiff muscles protested the movement. The air smelled wrong. That was Marley's first thought as they walked toward the building. Not bad exactly, just wrong. Like someone had tried to recreate the smell of fresh air, but had gotten the formula slightly off. She didn't mention it to the others, not wanting to seem paranoid. But the feeling persisted as they pushed through the glass doors into the main building. The interior was immaculate, almost aggressively clean, with shiny floors that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. A woman stood behind the information desk, smiling at them with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from people who've been told to be enthusiastic by a corporate manual. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Rest Area." Her voice was too bright, too cheerful for someone working the night shift at a highway rest stop. "Is this your first time visiting us?" Quentin exchanged glances with Marley and Leilani. First time. It was a rest stop, not a resort. Yeah, we're just passing through. Where are the bathrooms?" The woman's smile never wavered as she pointed down a hallway. "Down that way. You can't miss them. And make sure to check out our food court. We have wonderful selections, all fresh." The bathrooms were as clean as the lobby, almost sterile in their perfection. Leilani stood at the sink, washing her hands, and caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked tired, which made sense after 8 hours in a car. But something about her reflection seemed off. Like she was looking at herself through water slightly distorted. She blinked, and the feeling passed. Just exhaustion playing tricks on her eyes. She dried her hands and headed back out to meet the others. They found the food court, and that's when things started to feel genuinely strange. The place was busy, filled with travelers sitting at tables, eating meals, chatting with each other. But everyone looked slightly out of date. Haircuts that belonged to decades past, clothing styles that weren't quite modern, references in conversations that didn't match current events. Quentin approached the counter, where a teenage boy with a distinctly 1990s curtain haircut waited to take his order. "What can I get you?" The boy's name tag said his name was Travis. "Just a coffee, black." Quentin pulled out his phone to check the time, but the screen wouldn't turn on. Battery must have died, even though he could have sworn it was at 60%. Travis handed him the coffee, and Quentin tried to pay with his credit card. The machine beeped an error. "Sorry, man. Card readers are down. Cash only." Quentin pulled out a 20, and Travis made change, handing back bills that looked crisp and new but had serial numbers from 1997. Quentin stared at the money in his hand, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. Marley had wandered over to a rack of brochures near the entrance, the kind that advertised local attractions and hotels. She picked one up and felt her stomach drop. The brochure was advertising a theme park she knew for a fact had closed 15 years ago. She grabbed another, a hotel chain that had gone bankrupt in 2008. Another, a restaurant that hadn't existed since the early 2000s. Every brochure was outdated, advertising places and services that no longer existed. Her hands started shaking as she looked around the rest stop with new eyes. That's when Leilani saw the poster. It was on a bulletin board near the bathrooms, partially hidden behind announcements for community events. A missing persons poster, the kind that gets stapled to telephone poles and shared on social media. The photo showed a young woman, maybe mid-20s, with a bright smile. The poster was dated from 6 months ago. Leilani looked at the photo, then at the woman sitting at a table 20 feet away, eating a sandwich and laughing at something her companion said. It was the same woman. Same face, same hair, same everything. She was right there, not missing at all. completely unaware that people had been searching for her. Leilani grabbed Quentin's arm, pulling him over to the bulletin board. "Look at this, look." She pointed at the poster, then at the woman. Quentin followed her finger and felt reality tilt sideways. She was right. That was definitely the same person. He looked closer at the bulletin board and saw more posters. Dozens of them, all missing persons, all with dates ranging from weeks to decades ago. And as he looked around the food court, he started recognizing faces. That man in the corner, the one reading a newspaper from 1983. His face was on a poster dated 1982. The family at the table near the window, the poster was from 2015. They were all here, all the missing people. Just living their lives in this rest stop like nothing was wrong. Marley felt panic rising in her throat. "We need to leave. Right now." They started walking toward the exit, trying not to run, trying not to draw attention. But the woman at the information desk noticed them leaving. "Are you checking out already? Don't you want to stay for dinner? We have pot roast tonight." Her smile was still in place, but there was something desperate in her eyes now. Something that didn't match her cheerful tone. Quentin shook his head, mumbling something about needing to get back on the road, and they pushed through the doors into the parking lot. Except the parking lot looked different. There were more cars now, many more, filling spaces that had been empty when they arrived. Old cars, new cars, cars from every decade, all parked in neat rows. Quentin ran to where he'd left his SUV and stopped dead. It was still there, but it looked wrong. The paint was faded, like years of sun exposure had weathered it. Dust covered the windows. When he tried the door, it was locked. And when he peered inside, he saw a layer of dust covering the dashboard, like the car had been sitting there for months. What the hell is happening? Leilani's voice was shaking. Marley was checking her phone, but like Quentin's, it wouldn't turn on. None of their phones worked. They were cut off, isolated in this parking lot full of abandoned vehicles. Quentin looked back at the rest stop building and saw faces in the windows. All the people from inside, pressed against the glass, watching them. Not threatening, just watching, waiting. That's when Marley saw it. In the rest stop's front window, there was a reflection, and in that reflection, she could see a poster board, the kind they'd just been looking at inside. And on that board, she could see 3 new posters, 3 missing persons posters with photos she recognized because she'd taken them. One showed Quentin at graduation, one showed her at a family barbecue, one showed Leilani at a concert. The posters were dated 3 months ago. 3 months. "We've been here for 3 months," Marley whispered. "We came here 3 months ago, and we never left." Quentin shook his head, refusing to accept it. That was impossible. They'd just arrived. It had been maybe 20 minutes since they pulled off the highway. But as he looked around, really looked, he saw that the season was wrong. When they'd arrived, it had been spring, late afternoon light. Now it was summer, and the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange that seemed too vibrant to be real. Leilani started running toward the highway, toward the on-ramp that would take them back to the real world. Quentin and Marley followed, their feet pounding on the asphalt. They reached the ramp and stopped. There was no highway, just empty land stretching into the distance, no road, no cars, nothing. The rest stop existed in isolation, an island floating in nowhere. They turned back and saw the building, saw all those faces still watching from the windows, and understood with horrible clarity that they were trapped. The woman from the information desk appeared in the doorway. her smile finally gone, replaced by an expression of profound sadness. "You can't leave," she called out to them. "None of us can. I've been here since 1967. I stopped for coffee on my way to meet my fiancée. That was 58 years ago, and I'm still 23 years old. Time doesn't work right here. We don't age. We don't change. We just exist, forever caught in the moment we decided to stop." Quentin felt his mind trying to reject this reality, trying to find a logical explanation. But there wasn't one. They'd driven into something that shouldn't exist, a trap disguised as convenience, a place that collected travelers and held them forever. The rest stop looked normal from the highway, looked like any other facility, but it was a mouth, and they'd walked right in. Marley was crying now, and Leilani had sunk to her knees on the pavement. Days passed, or maybe hours, or maybe years. Time had lost all meaning in the rest stop. Quentin found himself sitting in the food court, eating pot roast that never got cold, drinking coffee that never ran out. Marley had stopped checking her phone, had accepted that it would never work again. Leilani spent her time reading the missing persons posters, memorizing the faces, wondering if anyone in the real world was looking for them, or if they'd been forgotten. Sometimes new people arrived, pulling off the highway, stretching their legs, commenting on how clean the rest stop was. And the three of them would watch from the windows, unable to warn them, unable to do anything but witness as the trap claimed more victims. The woman from the information desk, whose name they'd learned was Dorothy, said that sometimes the rest stop would let someone go. Not often, maybe once every few decades, for reasons no one understood. But most people stayed forever, trapped in this liminal space between where they'd been and where they were going. Forever caught in transit, forever waiting for a journey to resume that would never start again. What would you do if your dashcam showed you weren't alone during your entire road trip? Trey had installed the dashboard camera 3 months ago after a close call with an aggressive driver who tried to run him off the road. His insurance company had recommended it, said it would help with claims if anything ever happened. The camera recorded continuously whenever the car was running, saving everything to a memory card that could hold up to 72 hours of footage before it started overwriting the oldest files. Trey checked it occasionally, but mostly forgot it was there. Just a small black device stuck to his windshield, silently documenting every mile he drove. The road trip to his brother's wedding had been uneventful. 12 hours of highway driving, podcasts playing through the speakers, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks. Trey had made the drive solo, enjoying the solitude after months of working in a crowded office. He'd sung along to music nobody else would hear, talked to himself to stay alert, and generally appreciated the rare opportunity to exist without anyone else demanding his attention. When he finally arrived at his brother's place, exhausted but satisfied, he'd crashed on the guest room bed and slept for 10 hours straight. It was 2 days later, after the wedding festivities had died down, that Trey remembered the dash cam. His brother had been talking about getting one for his own car and asked to see Trey's footage, curious about what the video quality was like. Trey pulled the memory card from the camera and plugged it into his laptop. The files loaded quickly, each one time-stamped and labeled with the date. He clicked on the first file from his drive up, the one that started when he'd left his apartment 72 hours ago. The video played normally at first. There was Trey, visible in the corner of the frame where the wide-angle lens caught the driver's seat, pulling out of his parking space, merging onto the highway. The quality was impressive, crystal clear, capturing license plates and street signs with perfect clarity. Trey fast-forwarded through the boring parts, just long stretches of highway and traffic. His brother watched over his shoulder, nodding approvingly at the camera's capabilities. Then Trey saw something in the rearview mirror reflection that made him stop the playback. There was someone in the back seat. Just for a frame, barely visible, but definitely there. A figure sitting directly behind the driver's seat, caught in the mirror's reflection. Trey's mouth went dry. He'd been alone. He knew he'd been alone. He rewound the footage and played it again, frame by frame. There, clear as day. A person sitting in his back seat, facing forward, perfectly still. The figure was there for 3 seconds. Then the angle changed as Trey had adjusted his mirror, and the figure disappeared from view. His brother laughed nervously. That's weird. Must be some kind of video glitch, compression artifact, or something. But Trey was already fast-forwarding through more footage, looking for other appearances. And he found them. Dozens of them. Throughout the entire 12-hour drive, the figure appeared in reflections. Sometimes in the rearview mirror, sometimes in the side mirrors, sometimes reflected in the window glass when the sun hit it at the right angle. The figure was always in the back seat, always sitting in the same position, always perfectly still. Trey felt sick. He remembered that drive, remembered being alone, remembered looking in his mirrors, remembered the back seat being empty. But the camera didn't lie. The camera showed something that had been there, invisible to his eyes, but caught by the lens. His brother had stopped laughing now, leaning closer to the screen, his face pale. "Dude, what the hell is that?" Trey didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. He kept watching, unable to stop, drawn into the footage like it was a horror movie he couldn't turn away from. Around hour 4 of the footage, something changed. Trey watched himself pull into a gas station, saw himself get out and walk inside to pay. The camera stayed on, recording the empty car. Except it wasn't empty. The figure was clearly visible now, sitting in the back seat, and for the first time, Trey could see details. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing dark clothing. His face was turned toward the camera, and he was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Something else. Something that made Trey's skin crawl, even watching it through a screen 2 days later. The figure stayed visible for the entire time Trey was inside the gas station. 5 minutes of footage showing this stranger sitting in his locked car, not moving, just smiling at the camera. Then, the moment before Trey opened the driver's door to get back in, the figure vanished. Gone completely. Trey watched himself climb back into the car, completely unaware that anything had been there. He saw himself check the mirrors, look around the car with normal driver caution, and pull back onto the highway. But as soon as the car was moving again, the figure reappeared in the mirror's reflection. Trey's hands were shaking now. He wanted to stop watching but couldn't. The footage continued, and the figure became more active. Around hour 7, Trey watched himself take a phone call on his Bluetooth. He could hear his own voice on the recording, talking to his mother, reassuring her he was driving safely and would arrive on time. In the mirror's reflection, the figure was leaning forward, moving closer to Trey's seat, like it was listening to the conversation. Its head tilted, following the sound of Trey's voice. Then came the part that made Trey's brother stand up and back away from the laptop. Hour 9, on a particularly empty stretch of highway. Trey had almost fallen asleep at the wheel, his head nodding forward before he jerked awake. He remembered that moment vividly. Remembered the surge of adrenaline, remembered how close he'd come to disaster. But watching the footage, he could see what had actually happened. Just before his head had started to nod, the figure had leaned all the way forward, its hands reaching past Trey's shoulders toward the steering wheel. The car had started to drift right, toward the rumble strips. Then Trey had jerked awake, and the figure had withdrawn, and the car had straightened out. "It was helping you," his brother whispered. "It kept you from crashing." But that didn't make Trey feel better. It made everything worse. This thing had been in his car for 12 hours, watching him, and at one point it had touched his steering wheel. He could see it in the footage, clear as day, translucent hands gripping the wheel, guiding the car back onto the road while Trey had been on the edge of unconsciousness. The figure had saved his life, or maybe it had just saved itself from crashing along with him. The final hour of footage was the worst. Trey was getting close to his destination, and the figure was becoming more visible in the reflections, like it was growing stronger or more solid. During a long stoplight, Trey watched himself sit and wait for the green, completely oblivious. But in the rearview mirror, the figure was clearly visible, and it was mouthing words. Trey paused the footage and leaned close to the screen, trying to read the figure's lips. His brother had retreated to the other side of the room, no longer wanting to be near the laptop. Trey enhanced the image, zoomed in on the figure's face reflected in the mirror. The lips moved in a clear pattern, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Thank you for the ride. Thank you for the ride. Thank you for the ride." Trey felt bile rise in his throat. This thing, whatever it was, had hitched a ride in his car, had been there for hundreds of miles, invisible to him but captured by the camera, riding along like a passenger he'd never invited. The footage ended when Trey arrived at his brother's house. The final frames showed him parking, turning off the engine, grabbing his bags from the trunk. And in that last moment before the camera shut off with the engine, the figure was clearly visible in the back seat. It raised one hand and waved at the camera. Then the screen went black. Trey sat in silence, staring at the blank screen. His brother was at the doorway now, half in and half out of the room. "Maybe you shouldn't drive that car anymore," he said quietly. But Trey was already thinking about something else. He'd made dozens of drives over the past 3 months since installing the camera. Long commutes, weekend trips, late-night errands. The camera had been recording the whole time. 72 hours of storage, constantly overwriting, constantly recording. How many of those drives had he not been alone? With shaking hands, Trey clicked on another file. A drive from 2 weeks ago, his daily commute to work. He fast-forwarded through the footage, watching for reflections. There, in the side mirror, visible for just a moment. The same figure. He tried another file from a month ago. There again, a grocery store run from 6 weeks ago. There. It had been in his car for months, riding along, invisible except to the camera lens, accompanying him everywhere he went. Trey's brother had left the room now, unwilling to watch any more. But Trey kept going through the files, unable to stop, documenting every appearance of his unwanted passenger. The figure was in dozens of trips, always in the same position, always watching. Sometimes it would lean forward during turns, like it was helping maintain balance. Sometimes it would look out the windows, like it was sightseeing. Sometimes it would stare directly at the camera with that knowing smile. Then Trey found the footage from yesterday, the drive back from his brother's house to his own apartment. Another 12 hours, another solo trip. He watched the entire thing, his heart sinking as the figure appeared again and again in the reflections. But this time, something was different. As Trey watched himself arrive home and park in his apartment's garage, the figure didn't disappear. It stayed visible in the back seat as the engine turned off and the camera began its final shutdown sequence. The last frame of the recording showed Trey walking away from the car toward the garage elevator, his back to the camera. And in the back seat, the figure remained, still sitting there, not fading, not vanishing. just sitting in the parked car, waiting. The camera shut off, but the figure had still been there, which meant it might still be there now. Trey looked up from his laptop, his eyes moving to the window of his brother's guest room. Outside, in the driveway, his car sat exactly where he'd parked it 3 days ago. From here, he couldn't see inside it, couldn't see if the back seat was occupied. His brother appeared in the doorway, holding Trey's car keys. "Hey, I was going to move your car so I could get mine out. Do you want—" He stopped, seeing Trey's face. "Don't go near that car," Trey said quietly. "Please, just don't." His brother set the keys on the dresser and backed away. Trey turned back to the laptop and ejected the memory card. He held it in his hand, this tiny piece of plastic and silicone that had documented the impossible. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, on the corner of the laptop screen, he could see a reflection. The window behind him, the driveway outside, his car sitting in the evening light. And in the back seat of that car, barely visible but definitely there, a figure sat waiting, watching the house, watching him. Trey closed the laptop, but it was too late. He'd seen it, and somehow he knew it had seen him seeing it. The ride wasn't over. It had never really ended. What would you do if you drove into a town trapped in its worst day forever? Santana had been making deliveries for the same company for 6 years, and she knew every route in the state by heart. She could navigate the highways blindfolded, knew which exits had the best coffee, which rest stops to avoid, which stretches of road turned dangerous when it rained. So when the storm hit, sudden and vicious, turning the afternoon sky black and unleashing rain so heavy her wipers could barely keep up, she made a split-second decision to exit the highway and wait it out. The exit sign flashed by too quickly for her to read the town name, but that didn't matter. She just needed to find somewhere safe to park for 30 minutes until the worst passed. The exit ramp curved down into what looked like a typical small American town. Main Street lined with local shops, a few traffic lights, residential streets branching off in neat grids. Everything looked normal except for the complete absence of modern chain stores. No McDonald's, no Walmart, no Starbucks. Just local businesses with hand-painted signs and architecture that seemed frozen in time. Santana drove slowly through the rain, looking for a parking lot or a diner where she could wait out the storm. The streets were busy, people hurrying along sidewalks with umbrellas, cars splashing through puddles, everyone moving with urgent purpose. She pulled into a parking spot in front of what looked like a hardware store and cut the engine. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she watched people rushing past, and something about their clothing caught her attention. Everyone was dressed like it was the 1970s. Bell-bottoms, wide collars, platform shoes, hairstyles she'd only seen in old photographs. Santana frowned, wondering if maybe this town had some kind of retro festival happening. That would explain the costumes, the vintage storefronts, the complete absence of modern branding. A man ran past her van, and Santana got a good look at the newspaper he was holding over his head as a makeshift umbrella. The headline was visible for just a moment. Dam inspection scheduled for tomorrow. The date on the paper was September 15th, 1976. Santana's heart skipped. That had to be a prop, part of whatever historical reenactment was happening here. Except the paper looked genuinely old, yellowed and worn, and the man carrying it showed no signs of being an actor breaking character. He looked genuinely worried about getting wet, genuinely focused on wherever he was rushing to. Santana pulled out her phone to check the GPS to figure out exactly where she'd ended up. No signal. That wasn't unusual in rural areas. but her GPS should still work offline. Instead, the screen showed her location as a blank spot. No town name, no streets, just a gray void. She zoomed out, but the map offered no information. It was like she'd driven into a place that didn't exist on any digital map. The rain continued to pound against the vans. Ruth and Santana decided to wait a few more minutes before trying to navigate back to the highway. That's when she noticed the people's faces. Everyone rushing past looked frightened, not just inconvenienced by the rain, but genuinely scared. A woman hurried by with 2 children, and Santana could see tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rainwater. A group of men stood on the corner arguing about something, their gestures animated and desperate. Something was wrong here. Something beyond a historical festival or themed event. The fear in these people's eyes was too real, too raw. Santana opened her door and stepped out into the rain, immediately getting soaked. She approached the nearest person, a teenage boy loading boxes into the back of a pickup truck. "Excuse me, what's going on? Why is everyone so upset?" The boy looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "What do you mean?" "The dam, lady. They're saying it might not hold. The inspection got delayed again, and with all this rain..." He gestured at the sky, at the deluge pouring down. "My dad says we should evacuate, but the mayor keeps saying everything's fine." Santana felt cold that had nothing to do with the rain. "What dam? Where?" The boy pointed north, toward where the town seemed to end and hills began. "The Riverside Dam? Been there since the 50s. They've been saying for years it needs repairs, but the town can't afford it. And now, with this storm..." He trailed off, looking genuinely terrified, then went back to loading boxes with frantic energy. Santana stood there getting drenched, trying to process what she was hearing. This boy wasn't acting. He believed every word he was saying. He believed it was 1976, believed a dam was about to fail, believed his life was in danger. She walked down the street, her delivery uniform plastered to her skin, rain streaming down her face. A corner store had its door propped open, and Santana went inside, grateful to escape the downpour. The interior confirmed her growing dread. Everything was authentic to the 1970s. Not reproductions, not vintage items carefully curated for aesthetic purposes, but actual products from that era. Brands that no longer existed, packaging designs that had been obsolete for decades, prices that made no sense in modern currency. Behind the counter, a radio played news about President Ford, about Vietnam, about events that had happened half a century ago. The cashier, an older woman with worry lines deep in her face, looked up as Santana approached. "Can I help you, dear?" Her voice was kind but distracted, her eyes constantly flicking to the window, to the rain, to the clock on the wall. Santana didn't know what to say. How do you ask someone if they know they're living in the wrong decade? How do you explain that the world they think they're living in ended 49 years ago? "What day is it?" Santana finally asked, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof. "September 15th, 1976, the woman answered, like this was obvious. "Though if this rain keeps up, might be our last September." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitter fear. Santana felt reality tilting around her. This wasn't possible. Time didn't work like this. Towns didn't get stuck in the past. But everything her senses told her, everything she was seeing and hearing and touching, insisted that this place genuinely believed it was 1976, genuinely believed a disaster was imminent. "The dam?" Santana said slowly. "Has it failed before?" The woman's face went pale. "Failed? It hasn't failed yet, but everyone knows it will. The engineers have been warning us for months. Town council keeps dismissing them, says we don't have the money for repairs, says it's safe enough. But with this storm..." She looked out the window again, at the apocalyptic rain, at the people running past in panic. Some folks are leaving, packing up and driving out. But most people, they don't believe it'll really happen. They think the engineers are being dramatic. Santana's mind was racing. She pulled out her phone, tried to show the woman the date displayed on the screen. But the woman just squinted at it, confused. What kind of radio is that? She couldn't see it as a phone. Her brain literally couldn't process the technology because it didn't exist in her reality. Santana put the phone away, her hands shaking. She needed to get out of this town, needed to find the highway and get back to the real world. This place was wrong in ways she couldn't begin to understand. She thanked the woman and went back out into the rain, running to her van. As she climbed in and started the engine, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The van's clock had changed. When she'd parked, it had shown 3:15 p.m. Now it showed 2:47 p.m. Time was running backward, or the van was sinking to this town's reality. She threw the transmission into reverse, pulled out of the parking spot, and headed back toward where she remembered the highway entrance being. But the streets had changed. She drove down what should have been the main road leading to the exit ramp, but instead found herself deeper in a residential neighborhood. She turned around, tried a different street, ended up at a dead end. The town was rearranging itself, or her memory was failing, or something was deliberately keeping her from leaving. The rain intensified, coming down in sheets so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. People were running now, not just hurrying, running with the desperation of those who know catastrophe is imminent. Santana pulled over, trying to stay calm, trying to think. She looked at the dashboard clock again. 1:15 p.m.? Time was definitely moving backward. At this rate, she'd reach whatever moment this town was trapped in, whatever event had frozen it in September 1976. She had to get out before that happened, had to escape before she became part of this loop, doomed to relive the same day forever along with everyone else here. A massive rumbling sound shook the van. Santana looked north, toward where the boy had pointed, toward where the dam supposedly stood. The sound grew louder, a roar like the earth splitting open. Then she saw the water, a wall of it, impossibly tall, rushing down from the hills into the town. The dam had failed. The disaster everyone feared was happening. People screamed, cars tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The water was too fast, too massive, an unstoppable force that consumed everything in its path. Santana slammed her foot on the accelerator, driving perpendicular to the water's advance, praying she could outrun it. The van's tires hydroplaned on the flooded streets, but she kept control, kept moving. Behind her, the water demolished buildings, tossed cars like toys, swept away everyone who couldn't escape. The roar was deafening, drowning out even her own screaming. She saw a street ahead that looked like it might lead uphill, out of the valley, away from the flood. She turned hard, the van tilting dangerously, and gunned the engine. The water caught her rear bumper, lifting the back wheels off the ground. Santana gripped the steering wheel, willing the van to keep going, to find traction, to escape. The front wheels grabbed asphalt, and suddenly she was climbing, the engine screaming, leaving the water behind. She drove upward, not looking back, not slowing down, until she crested a hill and saw the highway ahead. The blessed, normal, modern highway with its digital signs and contemporary traffic. She merged onto the interstate, and the rain stopped instantly, like she'd passed through a curtain. The sun was out, the road was dry, and her dashboard clock showed 3:47 p.m., exactly 32 minutes after she'd exited the highway. Santana's entire body was shaking. She pulled over at the next rest area and sat there for an hour, trying to process what had happened. When she finally calmed down enough to think clearly, she looked up the town's name based on the exit number she'd taken. The search results made her blood run cold. The town of Riverside Falls, population 2,008 to 47, destroyed September 15, 1976, when the Riverside Dam failed after days of heavy rain. The disaster had been preventable. Engineers had issued warnings. But the town council had delayed necessary repairs. Everyone who stayed had died. The town was never rebuilt. The site eventually absorbed back into nature. It existed now only in photographs, in history books, in the memories of survivors who'd evacuated in time. Santana had driven into that town's final day, into the moment of its death, trapped in an endless loop of those last few hours before the dam failed. Some disasters are so catastrophic, they create echoes, ripples in reality that trap places in their worst moments. And sometimes, if conditions are right, if the storm is strong enough and fate takes a wrong turn, travelers can stumble into those echoes and experience history that never stopped happening. She never took that exit again. What would you do if you saw yourself driving another car and they were trying to reach you? Anaya had always been a night driver. Something about the empty roads and dark sky made her feel calm, like she was the only person left in the world and all the pressure of daily life had temporarily dissolved. She'd been driving for 3 hours now, heading home from a conference in the city, taking the scenic route through forested back roads because the highway felt too impersonal. The road wound through dense trees, occasionally opening up to reveal glimpses of a parallel route running through the woods about 100 yards to her left. She'd catch sight of headlights through the trees, another car traveling the same direction on that neighboring road. And it gave her a strange sense of companionship in the darkness. At first, she didn't pay much attention to the other vehicle. Just another traveler making their way through the night, following their own path home. But after 30 minutes, Anaya noticed the car was still there, visible through gaps in the trees, maintaining the exact same speed she was. When she accelerated slightly, the other car sped up. When she slowed for a curve, it slowed too. Perfect synchronization, like they were tied together by invisible threads. Anaya told herself it was coincidence. Two people driving at night, both maintaining reasonable speeds, both following the flow of their respective roads. Nothing strange about that. Then the roads converged briefly at an intersection where both routes met before splitting apart again. Anaya slowed as she approached, and through the trees to her left, she could see the other car more clearly now. Same make and model as hers, same color. Even from a distance, the similarity was striking. The intersection had a 4-way stop, and both cars reached it simultaneously. Anaya rolled to a stop, and so did the other driver. For a moment, they sat there, engines idling, and Anaya got her first clear look at the other vehicle. It wasn't just similar to her car. It was identical. Same year, same trim level, same aftermarket roof rack she'd installed last summer. The probability of that seemed impossibly low. Then the other driver's door opened, and Anaya felt her heart stop. The woman who stepped out, illuminated by the intersection's single street light, looked exactly like her. Same height, same build, same jacket she was wearing right now. The woman was staring at her car, gesturing frantically, waving her arms like she was trying to signal something urgent. Anaya's hands locked on the steering wheel, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This wasn't possible. She couldn't be in two places at once. This had to be a trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with her perception. But the woman kept gesturing, kept trying to get Anaya's attention, and now she was walking toward the intersection, toward Anaya's car. Panic overrode rational thought. Anaya slammed her foot on the accelerator, blowing through the stop sign, her tires squealing as she took the turn too fast. In her rearview mirror, she saw the woman running back to her car, saw her jump in and start pursuing. The headlights appeared behind Anaya, gaining rapidly, and she pushed her car faster, her heart hammering against her ribs. The parallel road diverged from hers again, disappearing back into the trees, and the pursuing headlights vanished with it. Anaya's breathing was ragged, her hands shaking on the wheel. What the hell had that been? A doppelganger? A twin she didn't know about? Some kind of elaborate prank? None of the explanations made sense. But the alternative, the idea that she'd just seen herself driving another car, was too impossible to accept. She focused on the road, on putting distance between herself and whatever that was, and tried to convince herself it hadn't really happened. But 10 minutes later, the parallel road appeared again through the trees, and so did the headlights. The other car was back, matching her speed, staying even with her position. Anaya could see it clearly during straight stretches where the trees thinned, and every time she looked, the wrongness of it hit her again. That was her car. Those were her movements, like looking into a mirror that showed her from an external perspective. The other driver was leaning forward, one hand on the wheel, and even from this distance, Anaya recognized her own mannerisms, her own posture. The roads converged again at a small bridge crossing a river. Only one lane, vehicles from both roads had to merge and cross single file before splitting apart again. Anaya reached the bridge first and started across, but halfway over, she looked to her right and saw the other car pulling up alongside her on a parallel bridge she hadn't noticed. Two bridges, side by side, both crossing the same river. The other driver was right there, separated by only about 15 feet, and they were looking directly at each other now. Anaya saw her own face staring back at her, eyes wide with fear and urgency, mouth moving, shouting something Anaya couldn't hear through the glass and engine noise. The other version of herself was holding something up to the window. A phone. The screen showed a photo, but Anaya couldn't make out the details. The other driver was pointing at the phone, then pointing ahead, then back at the phone, desperately trying to communicate something. Then the bridges diverged. The parallel road curved away, and the other car disappeared into the darkness again. Anaya's mind was fracturing. This couldn't be happening. Doppelgangers didn't exist. Parallel versions of yourself didn't drive identical cars on parallel roads. But she'd seen it, had looked into her own eyes, had seen her own expression of frantic desperation reflected back at her. She pulled over, hands shaking too badly to continue driving safely, and sat on the shoulder with her hazard lights blinking. Her phone sat in the cup holder, and she grabbed it, checking for messages, for missed calls, for anything that might explain this. Nothing. Just the normal accumulation of notifications from a day spent at a conference. Then she noticed her photo gallery had a new image. One photo, taken tonight according to the timestamp, but Anaya didn't remember taking it. She opened it with trembling fingers, and the world tilted sideways. The photos showed a massive accident ahead on the road. Multiple vehicles, twisted metal, emergency lights, a scene of absolute carnage. The location tag showed it was about 5 miles ahead of her current position. The photo shouldn't exist. She hadn't taken it, hadn't been to that location, hadn't seen any accident. But what if the other version of her had taken it? What if the other Anaya was trying to warn her, trying to show her what was coming? Anaya's rational mind rebelled against the idea, but the photo was right there, undeniable, showing devastation waiting for her down this road. She pulled up her GPS, trying to find an alternate route, but the screen glitched and froze. No other roads appeared on the map, just this one, leading forward into whatever nightmare was waiting. The parallel headlights appeared again, closer now, and Anaya realized the roads were converging, actually merging, becoming one. The other car was approaching from the left, and in seconds, both vehicles would be on the same road, heading toward the same destination. Anaya put her car in gear and accelerated, no longer running from her double, but driving alongside her. They were even now, two identical cars racing through the night, and Anaya looked over at the other driver. Her own face looked back, and this time she could read the words being mouthed. "Don't go forward. Turn around. Please." The other Anaya was crying, tears streaming down her face, one hand on the wheel while the other pointed frantically backward, toward where they'd come from. Then the roads fully merged, becoming a single path. And something impossible happened. The two cars started to overlap, occupying the same space, phasing through each other like ghosts. Anaya felt a sensation like being pulled in two directions at once, like her body was trying to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. For a brief moment, she was in both cars. She could see through two sets of eyes, feel two steering wheels under her hands, experience two versions of the same moment. In one version, she kept driving forward and reached the accident scene. She saw herself lose control, saw her car join the wreckage, saw the moment of impact that ended everything. In the other version, she slammed on the brakes, executed a desperate U-turn, and drove back the way she'd come, escaping whatever had caused that pileup ahead. The sensation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Anaya was back in her single car, alone, the parallel road, and its driver completely gone. But the memory of that dual experience remained, vivid and terrible. She'd seen her own death, lived through it from an external perspective, felt what it would be like to not turn back. Her foot was already on the brake, already executing the turn, following the path she'd seen herself take in the version that survived. She drove back the way she'd come, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and terror. After 20 minutes, she heard sirens approaching from ahead, emergency vehicles racing toward whatever disaster she'd narrowly avoided. She pulled over to let them pass. Fire trucks and ambulances speeding past with lights blazing. They were heading to the accident, the one she would have been part of if she hadn't seen herself, hadn't gotten the warning from a version of her that had somehow existed 5 miles ahead in time. Anaya found a motel and checked in for the night, unable to continue driving. She sat on the bed and looked at her phone again, at that photo of the accident. As she watched, the image began to change. The wreckage rearranged itself, and she could count the vehicles now. 4 cars, not 5. She'd removed herself from the equation by turning back, and reality had adjusted. The photo had shown her one possible future, and the parallel version of herself had been trying desperately to make sure she chose a different path. The next morning, Anaya checked the local news. An accident had indeed occurred on that road last night. A multi-car pileup caused by a drunk driver crossing the center line. 4 people injured, none killed. If she'd kept going, she would have been car number 5, and the article would have read differently. She checked her photo gallery, but the image was gone now, deleted by whatever force had created it in the first place. Anaya never learned what had really happened that night. Whether she'd somehow seen across time, whether parallel realities had briefly intersected, whether some version of her had died and sent a warning back to save herself. She only knew that she'd looked into her own eyes and seen them filled with desperate knowledge of what was coming. And she'd listened. Sometimes the universe gives warnings in impossible ways. Sometimes you encounter yourself at a crossroads, and one version knows what the other needs to hear. She never took that road again, and sometimes, late at night, she wondered if somewhere out there another version of her was driving that parallel road, watching through the trees, making sure this version stayed safe. What would you do if your car started broadcasting someone's dying moments while you were trapped in a tunnel? Jaciel, Indigo, and Zora had been friends since college, and their annual road trip was sacred tradition. Every fall, they'd pick a destination and drive there together. No flying allowed, because the journey was the point. This year, they'd chosen a route through the mountains, chasing fall colors and small-town diners, and they'd been having the time of their lives until the GPS directed them through the Blackstone Tunnel. The sign at the entrance said it was 15 miles long, cutting straight through the mountain instead of following the winding pass over the top. 15 miles of straight driving, maybe 12 minutes, and they'd emerge on the other side. Jaciel was driving. Indigo had claimed the passenger seat for this leg of the trip, and Zora was sprawled across the back with her earbuds in, half asleep. The tunnel entrance swallowed them like a mouth, and the sudden darkness was absolute for a moment before their headlights and the tunnel's dim overhead lights provided enough illumination to see. The walls were concrete, streaked with water stains and decades of exhaust residue. There were no other cars visible ahead or behind, and the echo of their engine filled the enclosed space with a dull roar. Standard tunnel experience. Nothing remarkable. Jaciel settled in for the 12-minute crossing and turned up the radio. Except the radio immediately cut to static. That made sense in a tunnel. No signal could penetrate this much rock. Jaciel reached to change it to their playlist. But before his finger reached the button, the static resolved into a voice. A man's voice, panicked and breathless, speaking in rapid gasps. I can't breathe. Air is running out. Someone please, if anyone can hear this." Jaciel frowned and glanced at Indigo. She was already leaning forward, turning up the volume, her expression confused. "Is that an emergency broadcast?" she asked. But it didn't sound like any emergency broadcast system they'd heard before. Those were automated, calm, informative. This voice was raw terror, a human being in the process of dying. The tunnel collapsed. "We've been here for hours, oxygen getting thin. Please tell my wife." The voice broke into coughing, wet and horrible. Jaciel tried changing the station, but every frequency carried the same voice, the same desperate message. He tried turning off the radio entirely, but the voice continued through the speakers, impossible to silence. Zora had pulled out her earbuds now, sitting up, listening with growing horror. "What is that? Jaciel, what's happening?" He didn't have an answer. The voice continued its monologue of desperation, describing being trapped, describing the darkness, describing watching the other survivors slowly suffocate. The details were specific, visceral, the kind of descriptions that could only come from someone living through a nightmare. Counting down the minutes. "We tried to dig, but the rocks won't move. Someone has to find us. Tunnel marker says mile 7. Indigo checked her phone, but there was no signal in the tunnel. She looked at the dashboard, at the trip odometer that tracked their progress through the tunnel. They'd gone 3 miles so far. Mile marker 7 was still ahead. "Should we turn around?" Zora's voice was small, frightened. Yaciel looked in the rearview mirror, at the tunnel stretching behind them, and made a decision. We're closer to the end than the beginning now. We keep going. Probably just some radio interference, some old recording bleeding through. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The voice was too immediate, too present, and it was describing their surroundings. The concrete walls, the overhead lights spaced every 50 feet, the dripping water creating puddles on the road. Details that matched exactly what they were seeing. So cold now. Can't feel my fingers. Air tastes wrong. The voice was weakening, the words coming slower, like the speaker was running out of energy, or running out of oxygen. They passed mile marker 4. The voice continued. Don't let them seal us in. Tell them we're still alive. They can't close the tunnel, not yet. Not while we're... The words dissolved into labored breathing. Indigo was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. There was something profoundly horrible about listening to someone die, about being unable to help, about being trapped as a passive audience to someone's final moments. Yaciel pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to get out of this tunnel, to reach fresh air and daylight and escape whatever sick phenomenon was happening. Mile marker 5. The breathing over the speakers was raspy now, irregular. Yaciel could hear other sounds in the background of the broadcast, other voices, weaker, some crying, some praying. How many people were trapped in whatever this was? The voice that had been narrating suddenly spoke directly to them. And that's when Yaciel's blood turned to ice. I can hear your engine. Someone's coming. You have to help us. Please stop. Please don't drive past. We're at mile marker 7. Please. The voice could hear them. This wasn't a recording. Somehow, impossibly, they were listening to something happening in real time. Something that could hear their car, could track their approach. Indigo grabbed Yaciel's arm, her fingers digging in painfully. We have to do something. We have to help them. But what could they do? The tunnel walls were solid concrete. There was no collapse visible, no debris blocking the road. Whatever the voice was describing, it wasn't happening in their reality. Or it had happened long ago. Mile marker 6. The voice was barely audible now, more breath than words. See your headlights. Getting brighter. You're close. Please stop. Mile 7. Right wall. We're behind. The right wall. Yaciel could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. The rational part of his brain was screaming that this was impossible, that they should ignore the voice and get out of the tunnel as fast as possible. But his humanity, that core part that couldn't ignore suffering, was warring with reason. Mile marker 7 appeared in their headlights. Yaciel slowed without consciously deciding to, and the car crept forward until they were exactly at the marker. The voice over the speakers let out something between a sob and a laugh. You stopped. Thank God you stopped. We can hear you idling. You're right above us. Help us. Please help us. Get someone to dig. We don't have much time left. Yaciel, Indigo, and Zora sat in the car, staring at the concrete wall to their right. It looked exactly like every other section of tunnel. No cracks, no damage, no indication that anything was behind it, except solid mountain. Zora opened her door and got out, walking to the wall, pressing her hands against it. Hello? Can you hear me? We want to help, but we don't know how. Her voice echoed in the tunnel, bouncing off the walls, but no response came except through the radio. Can't hear you. Too much rock. But you're there. I know you're there. Tell them to hurry. Please tell them to hurry. The voice was fading fast now, words slurring together, consciousness slipping away. Indigo was frantically trying to call 911, but there was still no signal. "We need to get out of the tunnel. Call for help. Send rescue teams." But even as she said it, she knew how it would sound. They'd tell emergency services that a voice on their radio claimed people were trapped behind a solid tunnel wall with no visible damage. They'd sound insane. No one would believe them. No one would send crews to drill through intact concrete based on a radio transmission that no one else could hear. The voice over the speakers gave one final, gurgling breath, and then there was silence. Not static, not white noise, just absolute silence, like the radio had been switched off. Jaciel, Indigo, and Zora stood next to their car at mile marker 7, staring at the wall, knowing that something terrible had just happened, but unable to process exactly what. Zora was pounding on the concrete now, screaming, "We're here, we heard you, don't die, please don't die." But there was no response. Just the echo of her voice and the drip of water and the hum of the car's engine. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Jaciel spoke, his voice hollow. "We need to go. We need to get out and call someone. Report this." They got back in the car, all three of them numb with shock, and continued through the tunnel. The remaining 8 miles felt like 800, an endless corridor of concrete that had just become a tomb for people they couldn't see, couldn't help, couldn't save. When they finally emerged into daylight on the other side, the sun seemed too bright, too cheerful, completely at odds with what they'd just experienced. Jaciel pulled over at the first opportunity, and they all tried to call emergency services, tried to report what had happened. But how do you report voices on a radio? How do you direct rescue teams to a location behind a solid wall? The operator was patient but clearly skeptical, said she'd pass the information along, but Jaciel could hear in her voice that nothing would be done. They had no proof. The voice was gone. The radio was playing normal stations again, as if nothing had happened. They sat at the roadside for an hour, trying to decide what to do. Finally, Zora pulled out her phone and started searching for information about the Blackstone Tunnel. What she found made everyone in the car go silent. In 1989, during construction of an expansion chamber at mile marker 7, a section of tunnel wall had collapsed, trapping 11 construction workers behind tons of rubble. Rescue efforts had continued for 3 days before officials determined there were no survivors. The decision was made to seal the collapsed section permanently rather than risk further instability. The workers' bodies were never recovered, entombed forever behind the concrete wall at mile marker 7. The accident had happened 36 years ago. The workers had been trapped, had run out of air, had died slowly while rescue teams debated whether it was safe to continue digging. And somehow, their final moments had bled through time, had been broadcast through the car's radio, replaying their death over and over for anyone who happened to be listening. Jaciel looked at his friends, saw his own horror reflected in their faces. They'd listened to people dying, people who'd been dead for decades, people whose last hope had been that someone would hear them and stop and help. They drove the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd heard. That night, in a motel room, Indigo researched the tunnel more thoroughly and found something that made her wake the others. Every few years, drivers reported strange radio interference in the Blackstone Tunnel. Voices pleading for help, descriptions of being trapped, always at mile marker 7, always ending in silence. The tunnel authority had investigated multiple times but found nothing. They dismissed it as urban legend, as radio signals bouncing strangely off the concrete. as imagination fueled by knowledge of the 1989 tragedy. But Jasiel, Indigo, and Zora knew better. They'd heard those voices, had listened to dying breaths, had stood at mile marker 7 knowing that just beyond that wall, 11 people had spent their final hours hoping someone would save them. The tunnel had become a permanent recording of that tragedy, playing it back for travelers who happened to have their radios on at the right frequency, trapping new witnesses in the echo of old suffering. They never spoke about it again after that trip. But all three of them took different routes home, routes that didn't involve tunnels, that didn't risk hearing voices that shouldn't exist, that didn't force them to stand helplessly while history repeated its cruelest moments over and over in the darkness beneath the mountain. What would you do if the road you were on defied the laws of physics and refused to let you reach the end? Rex and Kimber had left the city at dawn, planning a simple 50-mile drive to visit Kimber's parents for the weekend. They'd made this trip dozens of times over the 3 years they'd been together, knew every curve and landmark, could practically drive it with their eyes closed. The route was straightforward. Take Highway 47 north until it dead-ended at the small town of Millbrook, park at Kimber's childhood home, and spend 2 days being overfed by her mother and helping her father with yard work. Easy, familiar, safe. Or at least it had always been before. The first hour passed normally. They listened to a podcast about unsolved mysteries, argued playfully about where to stop for coffee, and watched the suburbs gradually give way to farmland. Rex was driving, one hand on the wheel and the other holding Kimber's hand across the center console. The morning sun turned the fields golden, and everything felt perfect and ordinary. Then Rex noticed the mile marker. Route 47 was only 50 miles long, marked from 0 at the city limits to 50 at Millbrook. They'd been driving for an hour at highway speed, which should have put them at least 45 miles in. But the marker that flashed past showed mile 32. Rex frowned, assuming he'd misread it. Except the next marker, a minute later, also showed 32. Kimber noticed it too. Did that sign say 32? We passed 32 like 20 minutes ago. Rex checked the odometer. Since leaving the city, they'd traveled 47 miles, according to the car's computer. But the mile markers weren't advancing. Another minute passed, and another marker appeared. 32. Same number. Impossible. Rex felt the first flutter of unease in his chest. That's not right. Mile markers don't repeat. He sped up, pushing the car to 70, then 75. The markers kept coming, all showing the same number. 32. Kimber pulled out her phone to check the GPS, but the app showed their location as a pulsing blue dot on a gray void. No map, no roads, no indication of where they were. The signal bars showed full strength, but when she tried to load anything, the connection timed out. Rex kept driving, kept watching the mile markers flash past in their unchanging repetition. Mile 32, mile 32, mile 32. The landscape looked right. Farmland and scattered houses, exactly what this stretch of highway should look like. But something fundamental had broken in the relationship between distance and destination. Try calling your parents, Rex said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Kimber dialed, but the call wouldn't connect. It rang and rang without going to voicemail, like it was trying to reach a number that existed in theory but not in practice. She hung up and tried again, with the same result. Rex glanced at the fuel gauge and felt his stomach drop. They'd started with a full tank. After traveling 47 miles, the gauge should show around 3/4 full. Instead, It showed half. They'd burned through more fuel than the distance should have required. Another 10 minutes passed. The odometer clicked over to 60 miles since leaving the city. They'd traveled 10 miles farther than the entire length of Highway 47, but mile markers still showed 32, and Millbrook remained invisible ahead. Kimber was gripping the door handle now, her knuckles white. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. Roads don't work like this. But it was happening, whether physics allowed it or not. They were caught in something that defied every rule of reality, trapped on a highway that refused to let them reach the end. Rex tried slowing down, thinking maybe speed was somehow a factor. He dropped to 45, then 30, watching the markers carefully. They still came at regular intervals, still showed the same unchanging number. Kimber pointed at something ahead, a farmhouse they'd passed at least 4 times over the years. The distinctive red barn with the faded mail pouch advertisement painted on the side. She knew this landmark, had taken photos of it before. They should have passed it 30 miles ago, but there it was ahead of them. They drove past it, and Kimber twisted in her seat to watch it recede behind them. 5 minutes, she said. Let's see if we pass it again. 5 minutes later, the red barn appeared ahead once more. Same angle, same position, same everything. They were looping, trapped in a section of highway that kept repeating, caught in a geographical impossibility. Rex noticed something else that made his breath catch. On the side of the road ahead was a car, broken down, hazard lights flashing. As they approached, Rex's vision started to swim. It was their car. Same make, same model, same license plate. Kimber leaned forward, staring, and then grabbed Rex's arm so hard it hurt. That's us. Rex, that's us in that car. She was right. Through the windows of the broken-down vehicle, they could see 2 people sitting inside. And those people looked exactly like them. Same clothes, same postures, sitting in what appeared to be their car despite the fact that they were also currently driving in their car. Rex's foot lifted off the accelerator involuntarily, and they coasted past the doppelganger vehicle. The 2 figures inside turned to watch them pass, their faces masks of exhaustion and despair. Then they were behind, lost in the distance, and Rex couldn't tell if they'd really been there or if reality was fragmenting around them. The fuel gauge continued its impossible decline. They'd burned through 3/4 of a tank now, despite the odometer showing they'd only traveled what should have been 90 miles. The math didn't work. The distance didn't work. Nothing worked according to the rules that governed normal existence. Kimber was crying softly, trying to stay calm, but failing. What's happening to us? Why can't we get off this road? Rex had no answers. He looked for exit ramps, for side roads, for any way to leave Highway 47. But there were none. Just the endless forward stretch of asphalt and the landscape that kept repeating. That's when they passed their car again. The broken-down version, hazard still flashing, but now it looked older. The paint was more faded. The tires were flat. Dust covered the windows. Through the dirt-streaked glass, they could see the figures inside. And those figures looked wrong now. Older, withered, like they'd been sitting there for years instead of minutes. Kimber turned away, unable to look, and Rex pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to put distance between them and that horrible vision of what they might become. The sun hadn't moved. That's what Kimber noticed next. They'd been driving for what felt like 3 hours, but the sun remained in the same position in the sky, suspended in eternal mid-morning. Time was broken, along with distance. stretched thin over this impossible highway that refused to end. Rex's hands were aching from gripping the steering wheel, his eyes burning from staring at the unchanging road ahead. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank remaining. Eventually, they'd run out of gas, and then they'd become the broken-down car on the roadside, waiting forever for rescue that would never come. Kimber suddenly leaned forward, staring at something ahead. The end. Rex, I can see the end. The town, there it is. Sure enough, buildings were visible on the horizon, the unmistakable outline of Millbrook's water tower and church steeple. Hope surged through Rex's chest, and he maintained speed, watching those buildings grow closer. But they grew closer slowly, far more slowly than they should at 60 miles per hour. The odometer clicked forward, showing they'd traveled 100 miles since leaving the city, then 120, then 150. The town remained ahead, tantalizingly close, but never quite arriving. The speedometer caught Rex's attention, and his mouth went dry. It showed 90 miles per hour, but he could feel the car moving at normal highway speed, could see the landscape passing at 60. The instruments were lying, or reality was, showing speeds and distances that didn't match actual movement. They were going impossibly fast while feeling normal, covering miles that didn't bring them any closer to their destination. The road had become a treadmill, letting them move forward forever while keeping them in place. Kimber made a decision. Stop the car. Just stop. Let's see what happens if we stop moving. Rex didn't argue. He took his foot off the accelerator and let the car coast, then pressed the brake. They slowed, and finally came to a complete stop in the middle of Highway 47. The engine idled. They sat in silence, both breathing hard, both terrified and exhausted. Then Rex opened his door. I'm walking. If the car won't get us there, maybe we can walk. They got out and started walking forward, leaving the car running behind them. The town was visible ahead, maybe a mile away according to their eyes. They walked for 5 minutes, 10, 15. The town didn't get closer. They looked back, and their car was still visible, still right behind them, like they'd walked in place. Kimber broke then, sitting down on the asphalt, sobbing. We're never getting there. We're never getting out. This road is going to keep us forever. Rex knelt beside her, his own composure cracking. She was right. They'd driven over 200 miles, according to the odometer, on a 50-mile road, had burned through nearly an entire tank of gas, had passed their own broken-down future selves, and hadn't gotten any closer to where they were trying to go. The road had folded space somehow, or stretched it, or created a loop that let them move forward endlessly without actually traveling anywhere. They were caught in a trap, made of physics, that no longer obeyed its own laws. Then Kimber stood up. No, I'm not accepting this. Watch. She stepped off the road, onto the gravel shoulder, then onto the grass beyond. She walked perpendicular to the highway, straight out into the field. Rex followed, and as soon as they left the asphalt, something changed. The air felt different, less thick. The sun finally moved, jumping forward in the sky. And when they'd walked maybe 100 steps from the road, they could see clearly. The town of Millbrook was right there, just beyond the next field, exactly where it should have been. They'd been within walking distance the entire time. They ran, stumbling through the field, and emerged onto a side street they recognized. Kimber's parents' house was 2 blocks away. They reached it, pounded on the door, and her mother opened it, shocked to see them. You're here early. We weren't expecting you for another hour. Rex checked his watch. An hour. They'd been driving for what felt like 3 hours, but had only been gone 60 minutes from when they'd originally planned to arrive. They told her parents they'd had car trouble, left the vehicle on the highway, and walked. Later, Kimber's father drove them back to retrieve it. But when they reached Highway 47, there was no car, no broken-down version of themselves, no sign they'd ever been there. Rex checked his odometer. It showed they'd traveled exactly 50 miles since leaving the city. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. Everything was normal, like the impossible journey had never happened. But Rex and Kimber knew better. They knew the road had caught them, had stretched distance into infinity, had shown them what it meant to travel forever without arriving. They were both 15 years older now. Not actually, not according to calendars. But their faces looked weathered. Their eyes held exhaustion that hadn't been there that morning. And when they looked in mirrors, they saw themselves aged by the experience of driving endlessly through space that refused to let them reach the end. The next week, they moved into Kimber's parents' house permanently. They never drove Highway 47 again. And sometimes, late at night, Rex wonders if somewhere out there, another version of them is still driving, still watching mile marker 32 flash past over and over, still trying to reach a destination that will forever remain just beyond the horizon, trapped in the endless road that feeds on travelers and never lets them go. If this story made you question every highway you've ever driven, hit that like button and subscribe to Verified Fears, because we've got plenty more tales that'll make you think twice before taking that next road trip.